Wesley Huff, yeah, was born in Multan, Pakistan. Woof. The country where marrying a first cousins is prevalent, and spent a portion, I'm not saying his parents are first cousins, and spent a portion of his childhood in the Middle East. Yeah, I've heard in Jordan, I guess. After being diagnosed with a rare neurological condition at the age of 11 that left him paralyzed from the waist down, Wes experienced a miraculous recovery that the doctors themselves said they had no medical explanation for. Are you supposed to end a sentence with the word for? Probably not. This experience, along with a great deal of study and soul searching in his later teens, between the ages of 18 and 22 is my guess, solidified his interest in the subjects of faith and engaging the beliefs and worldview perspectives of others. He spent his high school years in Northern Ontario and currently doing a PhD in New Testament at the University of Toronto's Wycliffe College. He's basically a preacher's kid, missionary kid, born and raised believing that Christianity is true. Had this experience where he had the flu or something and his nervous system attacked his spinal column, the nerves at the bottom of his spinal cord, instead of attacking the flu virus, and left him paralyzed for about a month. And then he had a full recovery.
This claim that they say they saw Jesus resurrected. Like there's something different that goes on there, that they're like, this is a miracle, right? Dead people don't usually rise from the dead.
So what is your personal belief when it comes to the resurrection? What do you think happened? Do you have a belief, or do you just try to interpret the text and try to see what is the message?
Well, I think, so as a historian, I do think it is a historical question. You have a guy who objectively lived, he objectively died, and then individuals close to his inner circle claim that
Notice the question is, do you believe it's true? And he hasn't answered it yet. I'm sure he does believe it's true, but just state, I believe it's true. Yeah, a man 2,000 years ago rose from the dead.
they see him not dead.
Right.
Again.
This is a highly unusual activity.
Highly unusual.
Right. So, but it's hard when you're dealing with illiterate populations, you're dealing with thousands of years of time, you're dealing with an oral tradition, and then you have us sitting here talking about it in 2024, trying to figure it at the end of 2024, trying to figure this out. Literally the end.
Yeah.
Last couple of days. It's very difficult for anybody who thinks of themselves as an intelligent person who's secular to even entertain the possibility that someone died and come back to life.
And I get that. But we've already talked about the fact that we don't think that the only thing that exists is matter and motion. We as in you and I, right? Like we believe that there's something else going on in this world that's a little bit crazy.
There's something else.
And
even if you believe that there's something else in the world that's a little bit crazy, in the year 2025 now, to say that a man rose from the dead based on evidence from 2,000 years ago, textual, historical evidence, most people who have not been indoctrinated in this belief and have some and don't have a personal experience that they attribute to this deity, you're not going to believe it. You just won't.
And that to, I think, exclude that, I think excludes something that you're kind of putting blinders on for.
Yeah, to exclude that, but you probably exclude other claims that are weird.
And you do have, I mean, you're right in terms of all of these ancient conventions and the ways that things were spread around. But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses.
Are you sure about that? That's highly contested. Think about it. Jesus died when he was about 30. If people who witnessed the death and resurrection in the 40 days that Jesus was walking around after he rose from the dead, how old would they be when the Gospels were written? Most scholars believe that the first Gospel, the Gospel of Mark, was written 65 to 70 AD. That would place the people who could verify this as being 65 to 70 years old. Some older, some younger. What percentage of the population lived to 65 to 70 years old? Christian apologists realize that what I just implied is true, that most would be dead. Not all. Some could have lived that long, especially if you're rich and had means to have good food and shelter. But most were dead. Anybody who could have said, no, that never happened. I was there. I was in Jerusalem during that time. And no. They probably lived to be 40, 45 at best.
They're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things. So,
how do you fact-check someone coming back from the dead?
Well,
How many people saw his body, right?
Well,
yeah. So he talked about the Gospels, and I'm sure he might, and other Christians might believe that the Gospels were written, 40, 50 AD, 10, 20 years after Jesus, not 30, 40 years. But I think the oldest New Testament book is Thessalonians, or maybe Corinthians. These are written in the 50s at best. That's 20 years after. And they were distributed or written to people in Greece or Corinth, Antioch. And if you just look at a map, bring up Google Maps and look where these places are, where Thessalonica is, where Antioch is, where Corinth is, and see how much time and money it might have taken someone who hears the message from Paul and says, I want to verify this is true. I'm going to make the trip to Jerusalem. My goodness, that would have been a trip, especially for poor people.
Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
Paul says 400? Why does he say 400? It's 500, isn't it?
400 people saw the crucifixion.
No, saw the resurrected Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once.
Why is he saying 400? 1 Corinthians 15. And that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12, and that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most who are still living. See, even Paul implies that people are starting to die off, and this is way before the Gospels, at least a decade. So even more people have been dying off. So anybody who wanted to verify this in Greece or Antioch would have to go make the long trip to Jerusalem and find people who are still alive to verify. And it's 500, not 400. Maybe just he misspoke. I don't know.
I mean, if we read the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Luke and Acts, so same author wrote these both documents, he says that Jesus was walking around teaching them for 40 days after he was resurrected from the dead. And
Jesus did not write anything down during that 40 days, by the way.
These are written within a time period,
at least that we have record of,
when you have people who would have seen Jesus's ministry, who were there, say, at something like the feeding of the 5,000, who could have been able to verify or debunk some of these things that are being said. And
if they were still alive,
go from a bunch of scared guys who, because Jesus wasn't the only messianic figure who arose and claimed to be the Messiah.
Right.
But the only true one.
There were a number of individuals both prior to and after Jesus, but they die and the movement dies with them.
Do you think it's possible that he didn't die? And do you think it's possible that they thought he was dead? Because that does happen.
Anything's possible, Joe.
There was actually a case
in the magical
very recently
kingdom
where...
Yeah, I mean, we know a lot about Roman crucifixion. And we know
brutal.
that, and we know that they did their job well.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, if you look at, say,
we know a lot about Roman crucifixion, and one of the things we know is that after people have died on the cross, they're left up for a certain amount of time, and then they're thrown in a common pit, not in a tomb.
Skeptical biblical scholars,
but Christians will say, but Jesus was special. There was a special arrangement given. And there was a follower of Jesus who was wealthy and took the body and put it in a tomb.
Non-believing atheist, agnostic, Christian scholars, they will say if we can know anything about Jesus, like they'll cast a doubt on a lot of the things that we read about in the Gospels in terms of the actual.
Oh, so he's admitting here that a lot of scholars, historians, will cast doubt on many things written in the Gospels. Why is that?
Historical Jesus of Nazareth. They'll say one thing we can be sure of is that he died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Because we have not just multiple attested documents that we refer to as the New Testament, but Roman and Greek and Jewish writers refer to that claim afterwards.
Okay, that doesn't mean it's true. I can refer to a claim that the Muslims make, that the Mormons make. I can be a scholar, a historian, someone really important. I could even have lived in a time of a decade from the events when they occurred and talk about these events. That doesn't mean those events actually happened.
But the chances of Jesus surviving the crucifixion, I think, are narrow to none. And the chance of him appearing 3 days later completely fine. I mean, you don't, if the first thing you do, if you survive.
Oh, I wish you would finish that thought. The chances of someone surviving a crucifixion is narrow to none. But what are the chances of someone not surviving the crucifixion and coming back to life? It's also narrow to none, right? But which is a higher probability of actually happening? Is it more likely that someone could survive a crucifixion, or is it more likely that someone actually died and rose from the dead? I would love to ask him that question. Historically speaking, if you were to assign probabilities, I think Wesley Huff would have to admit, yes, it's more likely someone survived a crucifixion than actually died and rose from the dead.
A crucifixion, and then you go and you find your disciples, the first thing you say is not, peace be with you. It's get me to a hospital, right?
Did they have them back then?
No, not really.
Also, are we entirely certain of their measurement of days?
So this is an interesting question because of the differences between when the Gospel of John says Jesus died compared to the Synoptics, because John appears to be using the Roman convention of counting time, and between the two, they match up pretty well. So the thing is, with Jews, any part of a day was considered a day. So 3 days and 3 nights becomes almost an idiom for any part of that day is the day. So if Jesus, and because they count evening and morning, evening to morning is the day, it's very possible that it wasn't like how we would think of 3 24-hour days, especially if he dies on Friday and wakes up on Sunday.
So that would...
A good question to ask Christians is what time of the day was Jesus crucified? Because the New Testament does answer that question, but it answers it in 2 different ways in 2 different books. And so when you ask an apologist that type of question, be prepared to get several pages worth of explanation.
Actually make it less time than more time.
Yeah.
So it's not like he had recovery time.
Oh, no, he didn't have recovery
That's
time.
what I'm saying. That's what I'm kind of getting. It's not like it was 3 days, it was actually 3 months.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So,
no, not like that.
Then 400 people saw him afterwards.
That's the claim that Paul makes.
Paul makes this claim.
Yeah.
500.
And how many different people have some sort of a recollection or a writing or something that's attributed to them of being witness to his resurrection?
Well, you have Peter, Paul, Jude, James, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The thing with Matthew, Mark...
But how many people basically said, I saw Jesus rise?
Well, you have Peter, Paul, Jude, James.
I would challenge Wesley Huff. Does Peter ever say in 1st or 2nd Peter that he saw the resurrected Jesus, that he was witness to the resurrection? Or is it implied? Is it assumed?
And Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The thing with
Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Is Mark a witness? No. Is Luke a witness? No.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke is that Matthew and John are attributed to direct disciples of Jesus.
Correct.
Luke and Mark are not.
Correct.
So they are not eyewitnesses within the Jesus community. In fact...
So Wesley Huff just admitted that there's 4 gospels. Half of them are not from eyewitnesses.
Luke prefaces his gospel by saying that. He's right up front about this. He's like, hey, I'm not an eyewitness. Don't confuse me with an eyewitness. But he actually uses conventional writing. What's the term I'm looking for? He uses writing conventions of the day that would fit within regular biography that was written within the Roman world.
Yeah. So if Luke was educated, the claim is that Luke is a physician. If he's educated, he would know if he wanted to make this sound historical, this is how you write it. Oh, so cynical, right?
So you have a guy named Quintilian who is basically, I mentioned him before with the, he's teaching people how to write. And he says that if you're going to write biography, you need to be interviewing eyewitnesses and you can't be too far away from the event.
You need to be interviewing eyewitnesses. Does Luke ever claim to interview eyewitnesses? Answer, no. Read Luke chapter 1 for yourself and read it very carefully as a Christian and see if Luke admits to interviewing eyewitnesses. And if you're honest with yourself, you'll say, no, Luke doesn't claim to interview any eyewitnesses.
To be able to write these things. And Quintilian, Lucian, and Josephus, who are all these very prominent ancient biographers and writers of history, have a lot of crossover in the way they describe how you should write history with the words that Luke uses at the beginning of his gospel, where he says, I'm interviewing eyewitnesses and I'm writing up an orderly account. And so he's saying, I'm going to use these methods that are expected as good history of my day. I'm not an eyewitness, so I'm going to try to find the people who are eyewitnesses, and I'm going to try to encapsulate this within a document that communicates what...
I don't even think Luke chapter 1 makes the claim that he's trying to find eyewitnesses.
But in the ancient world, nobody really had that big of a problem with these kind of supernatural claims.
This is important. What Wesley Huff is admitting here or stating here is that back in the 1st century, people were very superstitious. They didn't have a problem with supernatural claims. So if Paul's writing his letters to various churches and said, hey, here's a claim. This man rose from the dead. The typical person that day might have said, okay, sounds reasonable to me. So why ought they go check it out? They just believe anything.
The more of the kind of skepticism was why you would worship a crucified individual to begin with.
Wow. So they were less surprised that he was resurrected.
Or that you would worship a crucified like teacher was just seen as silly.
Because it's so humiliating to be crucified.
Yeah. Yeah. And that like a God would let himself go through this.
Right.
Like what are you talking about? There is an ancient writer who mocks Christianity, and he particularly mocks Christianity in saying that, of course, Jesus did miracles because Jesus had a childhood in Egypt. And he goes, all of those Egyptians are magicians anyways. So he just learned the magic when he was a child. So he actually confirms, incidentally, 2 things: that the narrative in the Gospels where it says that the Holy Family fled to Egypt during the...
He confirms what? That's what they believed? Or that's what was written? Or confirms that it's true?
Reign of Herod. He corroborates that he actually thinks that happened.
Yeah.
And that Jesus...
He just corroborates that he thinks that happened. Just like a historian might corroborate and think that Islam happened, that Gabriel met Muhammad in a cave. That doesn't mean it's true.
Jesus did miracles. He just attributes the miracles to Jesus being a traveling magician anyways. And, anybody who lived in Egypt knows some magic.
That is what's really fascinating, that the mindset of the people that lived back then was that whatever was going on in Egypt was so crazy that they had to be magicians.
Yeah. Yeah, but everybody believed in supernatural events. Like there's no such thing as
naturalism,
like a secular work in the ancient world. Even Plutarch, who's one of the most famous biographers in the ancient world, he wrote 90 biographies, of which 60 still survive today. He was a priest of Apollo. So like he's already assuming
Right.
that the gods exist, that crazy things are going to happen in the world. And so
Superstitious.
they didn't have a problem with people doing miracles or crazy things happening or
Well, that's also why it's so interesting trying to put your mind into the context of people that lived back then when you try to interpret what these stories were all about.
Yeah, this
Because
is good.
they did believe in things that weren't real. So when they talk about this thing that we're supposed to believe is real, when you have all this evidence that they believe things that aren't true,
yeah.
it's interesting, right? Because it's like you're now saying, yeah, but this one really was true.
Right.
Well, there's
Yeah. This is a excellent point. Huge, excellent point by Joe Rogan here. You're admitting to me, Wesley Huff, that these superstitious people in the first century believed many sorts of things that were untrue, except for this one. This one you're saying is true.
there's so many different things that they thought of and believed that weren't true.
Yeah. So this historiographically is, so when we do history, it's an inference to the best explanation. And so there are probabilities of things that have happened in history where we can say, okay, there's a higher probability of event A happening and a lower probability of event B happening. So the example I often give is like Jonah being swallowed by the fish. Like that's low probabilistically, not that it didn't happen, but that like as a historian, we got to like say, well, there's no independent cross-reference sources. You don't have multiple attestation for this particular event. The interesting thing about Jesus is that we have more evidence from different writings in the ancient world than we probably should have for someone of his stature.
That we probably should have for someone of his stature. Well, doesn't it say in the New Testament that Jesus performed all these miracles and was known all throughout the land, far and wide?
Because we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, these four biographies.
Are they independent? Is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John independent eyewitness accounts? You just admitted that Mark and Luke are not. So Matthew and John, are they independent of each other? Do they borrow at all from each other? Did they know each other? They were both disciples. Of course they knew each other. Do you call them independent?
There's really only one other person in and around that time that can claim to have that much kind of independent testimony of their life, and it's the Roman Emperor Tiberius.
We have many sources of people writing about Tiberius while Tiberius was alive. Guess how many sources we have of people writing about Jesus while Jesus was alive? 0. That's the truth.
The Roman emperor, who's the most famous, most powerful person at the time, has a similar amount of historiographical evidence biographically for...
Similar amount. I would love to challenge Wesley Huff on that. If we were to get, I don't know, a dozen historians, would they admit, if we're looking at first century evidence, writings, that they would say, they would agree with Wesley Huff that there's a similar amount of evidence for Jesus as there is for Tiberius? I think they would say it's not close. That Tiberius is way up here and Jesus is way down here.
Or his, the events of his lifetime that Jesus does.
What is interpretation of Jesus from non-Jesus followers at the time? Like what did they think he was or who he was?
He was a crucified traveling rabbi.
That's
yeah,
it.
I mean, you have individuals like Josephus.
That's what historians today believe. He was a crucified traveling rabbi, teacher.
Mentions him end of first century, beginning of the second century. He was a Jewish Roman writer. Tacitus mentions him, who also wrote about the emperor. And you have a number of these individuals, Cassio or Suetonius. But what they're doing mostly is describing what the followers of Christianity are saying about him.
Yes, exactly right, Wesley Huff. What these historians are saying is what other people believed about Jesus. That doesn't corroborate anything. that doesn't make it more probable, more likely that it's true that Jesus rose from the dead. Does it?